The humanitarian situation and the best means of providing aid to Palestinians in Gaza have been amongst some of the most controversial issues over the ongoing war in the Gaza Strip. I'm delighted that we are joined on this occasion by one of the individuals who's had the closest of associations and looks at the continuing efforts to provide humanitarian assistance into the Gaza Strip over many months now, and have the opportunity to discuss the realities of the situation on the ground versus the reporting around them and the media's coverage of these matters. Um, in circumstances where Hamas and other terrorist organizations have been continually seeking to divert aid and prevent access of humanitarian assistance to those civilians that are in most desperate need for it, this is certainly a hotly debated topic. And in the last few hours, we have had news that two Israeli men, a 20-year-old and a 60-year-old, have been murdered in a shooting incident at the Allenby Bridge crossing on the border between Israel and Jordan. And it's understood that this was a shooting incident committed by the truck driver of humanitarian aid that was destined for the Gaza Strip. This incident, which has just occurred, certainly highlights some of the complexities around securing the safe delivery of this much needed humanitarian assistance into the Gaza Strip. Now, on the 26th of May 2025, the Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, commenced direct distribution of individual food boxes into the Gaza Strip at secured sites. And it is the Reverend Dr. Johnnie Moore who is the executive chairman of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and he's been in this position since the 3rd of June this year. I'm delighted to be able to welcome him to this webinar. He was previously appointed twice to the bipartisan US Commission on International Religious Freedom, serving both under the Trump and Biden administrations. He is engaged with heads of state across the Islamic world, contributing to peace-building efforts such as the Abraham Accords. He's also the youngest recipient of the Simon Wiesenthal Center's prestigious Medal of Valor for his extensive work on behalf of threatened Christians in the Middle East, and he serves on the Anti-Defamation League's Middle East Task Force. In his business career, Dr. Moore founded the Kairos Company, a communications consultancy, and he has been awarded doctorates by Liberty University and Indiana Wesleyan University. He's also the author of 10 books, and he's recently been appointed Vice Chancellor of Pepperdine University's Washington, D.C. campus. Dr. Moore, Johnnie, if I may, I'm delighted to have your insights for our audience, and if you could begin by providing certainly an overview of how on earth you found yourself in this role, in this position, what it is that GHF has been involved in over the last several months, and your own assessments of the challenges of providing humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip and how these are being met.
Uh, Natasha, if I may, I thank you very, very much for hosting me today, and I'm really, really grateful for the people that are viewing this conversation. This is an issue that everyone in the world should care about, and most of all, those of us who care about the Middle East should care about this issue. To answer your first question about the situation generally and then how I got to it, I actually want to begin instead by just giving one very, very important statistic, which is that since GHF began operating, the foundation has provided 160 million meals of food for free to the people of Gaza. That's nearly 3 million boxes of food. It is each box containing a higher caloric counts than the mandatory UN standard. Each box capable of feeding a family of five for multiple days. There are all kinds of pieces of misinformation and disinformation about GHF that is for all kinds of reasons. You know, some of it is very, very intentional, an effort by activists in order to either preserve the existing system or to aid one side of this conflict. Or sometimes it's just by well-meaning people who just don't fully comprehend what it is to deliver humanitarian aid in the Gaza Strip, or to deliver humanitarian aid in an active war, which is the challenge of GHF. The reason why I did it is because I was asked to do it by the Department of State. And for many, many years, my government has been a government that's worked very, very well with individuals in the private sector, and in my case, most of my work has been in peace building and track two type of diplomacy, building peace between people. In fact, on October 7th, I was supposed to be flying to Israel actually to receive an award from efforts I participated in and to build bridges between Palestinians and Jews and other Arabs and the Jewish community and Israel. And then I was going from there to a Gulf country. It's quite clear that there are lots and lots of people in the Middle East who are dedicated to peace, and there are lots and lots of people that are highly, highly invested in continuing the conflict. From the beginning of the conflict, I have been very, very interested in finding a way to also help the Palestinian people, and in particular the people of Gaza, because while plenty of Gazans celebrated and participated in the attack on October 7th, there are many, many other Gazans who were in many ways the first victims of Hamas. The problem is that so much of the humanitarian system was able to be controlled by Hamas, which is a designated terrorist organization in the United States and also in the United Kingdom and in the EU. And the system was just profoundly flawed, even by their own statistics. UN agencies have struggled to actually get their food to people in need. I think at points the number was 92% of all aid entering into the Gaza Strip at points in this conflict was either looted or diverted, never making it to its final destination. So GHF was an effort to address that singular issue. How can we make sure that more food gets to the people of Gaza? How can we make sure that it isn't diverted or looted along the way? And the effort to solve that problem actually began in the previous presidential administration, the Biden administration, and in the Trump administration. There was sort of a pivotal moment, which was on May 5th, when the president of the United States in the White House was asked a question by someone in the press about humanitarian assistance in Gaza. And he said that he was frustrated and in fact angry that Hamas was able to steal food from the people of Gaza, and the United States was going to do something about it. And so GHF is the implementation of that policy from the President of the United States to make sure that more aid made it directly to the people. Uh, I should say that it would have been a very, very different environment, perhaps, if we would have waited if GHF would have waited to operate in a ceasefire environment. That was not the case. This is an active war, and in an active war, it is as complex a humanitarian crisis as we've seen in the world, not only because of the nature of this conflict, but also because of the very, very small distance of land, that all of this is happening in. And so it has been unbelievably challenging, and the challenges have been made worse by a lot of disinformation and misinformation. I sometimes made the observation that we actually have experienced over the last 2 years the first world information war. It's a new phenomenon, and I think that's incredibly, incredibly alarming. And that information war has been in the service of lots and lots of interest. But I'll just highlight a few points about GHF that maybe aren't as well known. Um, First of all, GHF staff, both men and women on our staff, have worked across the UN system for many, many years and across the world's largest NGOs. It is an incredibly, incredibly experienced team that was convened on the ground. Uh, GHF is no longer just distributing boxes of food. We've distributed tens of thousands of metric tons of ready-to-use food supplements. These are the high nutritional food packets for children. We've now distributed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of those packets. The same nutritional supplements that UNICEF distributes, and in this case, we were able to get it from a private large NGO. Uh, Palestinian women have become really indispensable partners of GHF. Not only do we now have women-only distribution, but actually on the ground at some of our distribution sites, again, not through a UN partner, but through a private sector partner or another NGO, in this case, Samaritan's Purse, we actually are able to provide basic, very rudimentary, but basic healthcare for people who need simple issues addressed, but also very often we're helping pregnant women, in fact. If the United Nations, and I should say that, at the very, very beginning of our operation, it was quite clear that the large UN agencies didn't trust what we were doing and aimed to shut down or dismantle our efforts. That, thank God, has changed over time. We still have plenty of critics in the UN, and we have plenty of criticisms of the UN. But the status quo is that the very, very large UN agencies have publicly stated, and we have publicly appreciated the fact that we can coexist. That the UN and GHF, hopefully one day GHF and these UN agencies can collaborate more actively together, but at least under the present circumstances, we can coexist doing work together in order to make sure that more food and more help get to the people of Gaza. Uh, I think that is largely the product of just GHF actually operating. One of the conversations I had early on in my involvement with the organization, which by the way was always meant to be temporary. I was stepping in to provide interim, meaningful leadership to this effort, and I said from day one, the one thing we have to do for the people of Gaza, and because of the situation, is we just have to show up every single day to help people in need. And that's what we've done day in and day out. We've had a lot of private, sometimes secret, meaningful engagements with the large UN agencies, and that has produced, I think, a growing level of trust. And in fact, we've advocated on several occasions for the surging of aid into the Gaza Strip, both on our behalf, but also on behalf of UN agencies. I think we would love to see the UN take more advantage of what GHF can offer, because the one thing that we have done that was once believed to be impossible, I think, was that we have prevented the looting and diversion of aid. And diversion, by the way, is this technical humanitarian term, which, I'm not sure why the term was chosen. It is a term that I think is best redefined as stealing, very often with people at guns, stealing aid the moment it goes into the Gaza Strip. And this is part of what prolonged and has prolonged this war. There are many reasons why this war continues, but one of the reasons is that virtually every piece of aid that went into the Gaza Strip was either by coercion or threats of coercion able to be controlled by Hamas. Hamas would take a certain percentage of the aid for their own fighters. They would take additional aid and they would sell it to produce revenue. Sometimes, not sometimes, over the course of this war, hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue. And at points in the conflict, actual aid convoys, knowingly or not, they were used to actually move fighters and messages for Hamas across the Gaza Strip. So this was a profoundly broken system. I think the international community basically had decided that the cost of doing business was these imperfections, and yet what GHF has demonstrated is that that is not the cost of doing business. We can create secure humanitarian convoys. We can create large scale distribution sites. We can even do community distribution, working with local partners to take food directly to those who can't come to us. One of the major criticisms of GHF was that we were replacing 400 UN distribution sites with four distribution sites, for instance. And the criticism is disingenuous to begin with, because those 400 distribution sites, frankly, don't exist anymore. This war has been devastating. The Gaza Strip does not exist as it existed before. and uh, and in our effort to get food into the Gaza Strip, particularly when we started at the direction of the president earlier this year, or at the beginning of the summer, the goal was to surge as much food as possible into the Gaza Strip on scale because people desperately, desperately needed it. And in fact, if you look, and there's a lot of questions about UN data. I have my own criticisms about the UN data and UN decisions. In fact, a report came out from a UN agency yesterday that referenced GHF, but GHF actually was never contacted by the UN agency for any information whatsoever in that report. This has been a common practice in the way the UN certain UN agencies, not the humanitarian ones, but the other more politicized agencies have behaved over the course of this conflict. But actually, if you take the UN's data at face value, it's quite clear that there is far less food insecurity around the distribution points where GHF has been operating. If UN agencies like the World Food Program and like UNICEF worked more directly with GHF, there are a few things that could happen immediately. We could scale up to a higher level. We could add more distribution sites, reaching more people. This is really, really critical now as we're watching more people being displaced. Um, GHF and the UN could work together to push Israel in many, many circumstances. We actually have a relationship with Israel that's no different in many ways than the UN relationship. The UN agencies, the way they interact with COGAT, it's not at all different from the way we interact with Israel. The difference, I would say, with GHF and with many of the UN agencies is that the Israelis know that we take seriously this issue of the diversion or looting of aid, and it appears to me that the Israelis are not convinced that the UN agencies take that seriously at all. And so it's a different level of trust. By the way, the trust will be further threatened today as we find out more information about this attack on the Allenby Bridge and what led to it. If we could work together, and I'll wrap up my opening comments in a moment, but we could actually work collaboratively, leveraging our trust, leveraging our mutual expertise in order to deliver more aid, not only in the easier parts. There's nothing easy in the Gaza Strip, but in the easier parts of the Gaza Strip, but also into the more difficult parts of the Gaza Strip, including the north. Um, and with more aid at each site, we could operate continuously throughout the day rather than these intermittent um, distribution. We could also make our aid distribution sites a type of warehousing. We could provide additional logistical support to make sure that aid convoys from the UN actually get to their destination. Um, we could expand our community-based program. I mean, there are all kinds of things that we could do if we started working uh, more collaboratively with the UN. And I should say, while we're very, very happy to coexist with the UN, it has always been our ambition to work together. Together, we are not designed to do this job alone. GHF was designed as a stopgap measure to provide additional food on scale into the Gaza Strip, and it wasn't actually designed to work to replace or to operate separate from the United Nations. And so those are some maybe misnomers corrected, some more of the story for GHF. And I should say, and Natasha, to answer your original question, when I was asked to do it, why would I do it? It's really simple. I care about peace in the region. I want to see this war come to an end. That's a policy of the United States of America. I think that's the all kinds of reasons and all kinds of opinions on that. I think everybody is eager for the war to come to an end. And I'm a Christian, and there is nothing more Christian in my text than feeding people who are hungry. And so for me, despite how complex this was, I didn't have to think very hard when the U.S. government asked me if I would step in.
Johnny, I'm particularly grateful for the insights that you've already been able to provide. I'm going to invite our audience to put their questions for our discussion now into the Q&A facility on Zoom and pick up a few areas with you in the first instance, if I may. Firstly, your reference to this term of diversion, and I may be able to assist somewhat there because my understanding is that it's come from the legal texts that surround the provision or the facilitation of humanitarian assistance, in particular, Article 23 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which concerns the obligation on a belligerent, a party engaged in armed conflict, to facilitate aid to the civilian population with a very significant caveat, and that is to the extent that the party is satisfied that there are no serious reasons for fearing that the consignments may be diverted from their destination. And ultimately, that diversion in these contexts takes place by the armed forces of the other side. In this case, by, as you say, the internationally prescribed terrorist organization Hamas. But such an extraordinary percentage, 92% at times, and that, as I understand it, was acknowledged or reported even by the United Nations. Um,
Yeah.
I appreciate you've referred to this as their assessment of the cost of doing business. But that can't be so easily dismissed.
No,
And
no, no, it can't. It can't. I mean, when it's virtually everything. And so at a certain point, you have to say, like, at what point are you aiding and abetting one party to the conflict? And very often JHF is accused of not complying with the four major principles of international humanitarian law, which there's a lot more nuance to that, as you know, than most people recognize. In fact, these four principles actually aren't in international humanitarian law. They're sort of an agreement, to be a part of the system and to collaborate. But we do, and we designed GHF in the very beginning to comply with these four principles. But as I, I think the UN has a lot of work to do to make sure they're complying with it. And there's no scenario where any governments can say, like, 92%. While I, certainly recognize that it's a technical term and a legal term, as you also know, and which I also understand, but it's stealing, and they're stealing it in order to aid themselves, to aid one side of the conflict, and it cannot happen, and it's just discounted.
right, the Q&A has exploded. I'm going to come in on to those in due course. But I do want to just pick up on these principles of international law and or I'd say humanitarian assistance in particular, and some of the criticisms that have been leveled at GHF. The United Nations and other NGOs that have been working on the ground for some time that, in this context of this significant diversion or stealing of aid, do you have any insights into their approach to working on the ground in Gaza and whether or not they are simply finding themselves in a position, if they are operating in areas that are controlled by Hamas, and let's be frank, that Hamas still does control, it seems, significant parts of Gaza, that there's no alternative to essentially allowing these terrorists to, and we've seen video footage of this, seize this aid violently, or that they are required to, if you will, collaborate with these terrorist organizations because that's the only way to operate in terrorist controlled territory, and how that sits, coming back to these principles of humanitarianism, how that sits with this principle of impartiality or even, neutrality in this case. What's your assessment of what was happening before GHF came on the field?
Yeah, so I think there are two important observations there. The first one um, has to do with a policy decision that some people at the UN made. I'm not sure who made the decision, but that UNRWA would be the only and most important mechanism in the future, as it has been in the past for the UN, of not only distributing food, but all kinds of services in the Gaza Strip. I mean, the Gaza Strip was an aid-based economy. It just was, and it was for many, many, many decades. Uh, I think it's important to recognize that whether you are a critic of UNRWA or not, the United States, my country, and in the aftermath of October 7th, many, many European countries were profoundly, profoundly critical of UNRWA. The United States persists in that criticism. In the first Trump administration, UNRWA was defunded. In the second Trump administration, UNRWA has not only been defunded, but the Department of Justice has actually issued a legal opinion that UNRWA actually doesn't qualify for international organizational immunity. I think a lot of people expect the Department of Justice to join a number of private lawsuits in the United States where UNRWA employees or UNRWA institutions were parties to acts of terrorism which killed American citizens. So if you're betting on UNRWA as the only solution to address the humanitarian issues in the Gaza Strip, whether you dispute UNRWA's exposure to terrorism, by the way, one report I read said that something like 49% of UNRWA employees had some connection to Hamas. I mean, there was a meeting in Doha a couple of weeks ago between an Iranian delegation and a Hamas delegation, and one report I saw recognized the face of someone on the Hamas side of the table, and it was a former UNRWA teacher. So whether you agree or disagree or dispute or do not, dispute those facts, the fact of the matter is, if you're betting on UNRWA to resolve its political issues with the United States or with the state of Israel for that matter, because Israel will not let UNRWA provide services in the Gaza Strip, then the people who are going to suffer are Gazans. And by the way, you don't have to bet on UNRWA. We have the World Food Program, we have UNICEF, we have GHF. But I think it's quite clear that someone in the UN system basically decided to hold the system hostage in order to save UNRWA. And I just, again, agree or disagree with UNRWA. That's a very perilous policy decision if you legitimately care about the people of Gaza, because UNRWA has bigger problems than they're going to be able to solve in the middle of this active conflict. And the second observation is that UNRWA actually has enormous stockpiles of food and resources and other things. And so the GHF position has actually been that we will help any UN agency, feed people. We can't cooperate with UNRWA as an initiative of the United States. But what we could do is we could go pick up their 6,000 trucks of food and we can deliver them into the Gaza Strip. But UNRWA till now, has refused to allow us to do that, and it doesn't appear that other UN agencies are sort of pressuring them to do it either.
And to be clear, these are stockpiles of food in the Gaza Strip, post facilitation by.
Well, they're two. So there's UNRWA has supplies in Egypt and Jordan
Right.
dedicated to the Gaza Strip, and then still we have this issue within the Gaza Strip of hundreds of truckloads of UN food and other resources that are sitting within the Gaza Strip. And I would add a third point. The irony of this whole thing is outside of the Gaza Strip, UN agencies routinely for years have used security in order to get food to their final destination. It's just for some reason these rules they've chosen aren't applicable in the Gaza Strip. And I think that's one of the things that's frustrating some of the very, very experienced people in the UN system, because they actually look at what we've been able to do by working with local Gazans, by taking security seriously, by creating humanitarian corridors, and they wish actually that they were operating in a similar environment.
That's a very interesting distinction to draw between the operators in these UN and other humanitarian organizations who are on the ground and perhaps seeing the realities and the leadership of these organizations. I know that you've said that the UN's position towards GHF has softened somewhat, but I did want to ask about the major criticisms, especially at the start of GHF's work. And in particular, one questioner says, why do you think the UN appears to be so against your work? I certainly recall at the beginning of the GHF operations, I was in Copenhagen and Oslo engaging with Amnesty International on one of their reports. And because it was topical, GHF was a somewhat fraught topic. And the allegation that they were advancing is that you are weaponizing aid. So could you perhaps first respond to that and then on a bigger picture level indicate why it is that this and other allegations may have been leveled, at least in the initial period?
I mean, I think in certain circumstances, it's just politics. I mean, we're not a political organization. GHF is a humanitarian organization. That's the purpose of GHF, is to provide humanitarian assistance. I'm afraid that we've seen the total politicization of this entire conversation, and I do think there were no efforts really to ascertain or to understand the facts. Or secondarily, I mean, it was clear at the beginning of the conflict that, one of the tactics in the Hamas side of this information war is that Hamas, from the very beginning of the war, has routinely released a daily casualty number, and it comes from the so-called Gaza Health Ministry, which is, of course, entirely controlled by Hamas. And they would not distinguish between civilian casualties and militants. Well, at the beginning of GHF's operations, there were some days where like every casualty in the Gaza Strip, was attributed to GHF, and this was a brazen disinformation effort in order to try to get GHF shut down, frankly. And part of it had to do with a lot of conspiracy theories. There are a ton of conspiracy theories in the Middle East. Anyone that has operated in the Middle East for any period of time understands that. And one of the conspiracy theories was that that this was a an Israeli directed, Israeli controlled, and entirely an Israeli initiative. And it actually, on the contrary, it is an American initiative. It is a American controlled, and it is this is the U.S. effort to feed the people of Gaza. And I think there are lots and lots of aspects of that conversation that ended up infusing public opinion about GHF, and then frankly a lot of you know GHF is, I've sometimes made the observation that GHF is not it's an American organization, not an Israeli one. It is not a Jewish organization. I'm not Jewish. We don't really check someone's religion or ethnicity or such. If they work for us, I don't know if we have how many Jews we actually even have working for us, if any at all. And yet, what I was witnessing as someone who spent a lot of my life working in human rights in the Middle East and on religious freedom issues, including on behalf of the U.S. government on USCIRF, uh, I was witnessing the same sort of tactics, anti-Semitic tactics that target the Jewish community around the world being applied to GHF. So there were like double standards were being applied to GHF that would never be applied to the United Nations. There was a global effort to delegitimize GHF from the very, very beginning. And what was even more alarming is that those efforts to shut down this were going on the same train tracks of anti-Semitism that we're witnessing all over the world, including facilitated, frankly, by some hostile foreign actors who are anti-American, anti-Western, not just anti-Israeli. And the irony of all of it is here we are trying to help the people of Gaza, trying to help feed the people of Gaza, and we're spending 20% of our time trying to fight an information war just to exist. And the only people that were suffering were the people of Gaza. And I think that's the irony of the whole thing. And so, it's a long answer to a simple question, but I just think there are a lot of people around the world that sit in chairs that claim to be humanitarians, but they're actually politicians. And frankly, we have seen a bit of the hijacking of the credentialing process around the world. And we have a lot of activists sitting in seats for experts. And I think that's an incredibly, incredibly alarming trend.
Well, you certainly preempted a few of the questions that I wanted to add on the major criticisms against GHF, which have also appeared in some of the questions from the audience. But I will still put them so we can get the detail on this, if that's all right. One question asks, there were daily reports some time ago of people being shot attempting to access the aid. The Israeli authorities said they would investigate what is the truth of these reports and the outcome of any investigations. And another questioner asks, has there been a decline in the number of people being killed while trying to get to GHF sites? Obviously, that questioner does make certain assumptions here. And if so, how has that been achieved? And once we've dealt with that, I'd love to drill down a little bit more into the practicalities of how it is that these sites are set up, established, and protected. But could you grapple with, these very serious allegations that Palestinians have been mowed down either by Israeli forces, by GHF staff in these attempts to access aid.
Yeah, first of all, it's important to understand that the security contractors who help facilitate the movement of food into the distribution sites in the Gaza Strip for GHF are incredibly experienced professionals. They're mainly retired members of the U.S. Armed Forces who, at this phase of their career, decided they wanted to feed people, and that's why they're there. Uh, and they're there because of their expertise. We sometimes have noted that they're there not because they know how to use a weapon. They're there because they know when not to use a weapon. And not a single time has anyone been harmed by a GHF staff person in any of our distribution sites over the course of the entire operation. It is clear that there have been some people that have been harmed seeking aid in the Gaza Strip. Most of the time, I would say most of the time because we don't have all the data, but we strongly suspect that at certain periods of this over the summer, the majority of those casualties actually took place at the hands of Hamas in order to either control food or to misattribute these casualties either to the IDF or the GHF. It is also the case that some of the casualties had nothing to do with humanitarian assistance. They were either, civilians that were caught in fire in the line of fire, or not civilians at all. But those are questions for the IDF. And what we do when there are one of these reports that emerges from the Gaza Strip is we immediately investigate it ourselves. We need to know what's happening around our distribution sites. We take it incredibly seriously. And we don't deny that there have been civilians that have been killed seeking aid in the Gaza Strip. We just deny the scale and the nature of of those civilian casualties. I would say and now actually, because the UN, and again, we don't trust the UN numbers because we think that Hamas has a disproportionate ability to influence those numbers, and the numbers are taken at face value. But even if you take the UN numbers at face value, it is the case now, I think in its entirety, that there have been far more civilian casualties seeking aid via UN mechanisms than allegedly GHF mechanisms. So this is a problem of operating in an active war. I do think the fact that the UN doesn't get the same level of scrutiny as GHF does when there's an alleged incident is just sort of telling of the broader information environment that this whole thing is operating in, a highly politicized environment.
But there's an additional very troubling aspect of this, which comes out of your response, which is that you say you can be clear that GHF has not fired at all over this period certainly at civilians, um, but that Hamas has been shooting at civilians that are seeking to access aid distribution across the Gaza Strip. I appreciate, but that is not something that is
It-
reported by the
no,
international media.
sorry to interrupt, but I'm actually Hamas did kill 12 of our local Gaza aid workers, and this was early in our operation, and I expected at least to get the sympathy of the world for those local Gaza aid workers who lost their lives trying to feed their local communities. And ironically, and I won't name the organization, but there's a large international humanitarian organization, a medical organization that was basically operating in the hospital where Hamas took both the injured and the killed of our Gaza aid workers. And that organization apparently um, either didn't try or wasn't able at all to provide health care to those local Gaza aid workers.
And they were left in the
They were left
outside of the
outside.
hospital.
They were literally left outside the door of the hospital to make an example of them. Um, that same organization has become an incredible critic of us, yet despite early on in the operation had asked us a favor to help take care of some of their supplies, which we gladly did. And I think there are questions about, like, that's an organization where there are real questions about whether some of their employees actually have connections to some alarming actors on the ground, and in fact, it's now probably about to get, based upon some information I heard the other day, some quite serious congressional scrutiny in the United States because the organization is headquartered in a U.S. state.
And at the risk of stating the obvious, Johnny, before GHF involvement, reports of up to 92% of aid being diverted, stolen by Hamas. GHF comes along. How much of the aid that GHF has distributed has been similarly diverted or stolen?
I mean, none. I mean, there could be like
It wasn't a trick question. Yeah, I appreciate,
yeah,
but
there could be like a box or that. I mean,
right.
but the issue is whole trucks were being taken, and so yeah, I mean, the exact opposite.
The
And
point I was simply seeking to draw out is that, Hamas's opposition to your operations there stems, I would imagine, from the fact that you have broken the business model by preventing that aid being diverted and stolen. But the fact that they are going so far as not just to threaten GHF, but also to murder local aid workers that you are working with.
uh, Hamas does this to Gazans all the time. I mean, these horrible videos of people's legs being broken and all of these things, and that's one of the things that grieves me the most. Like, you know, we've actually come to love many of these local Gazans that we interact with. They because their food is no longer controlled by Hamas. They've actually found some freedom to sort of express their own points of view, and we're seeing this with very, very brave women, and it's an incredible thing to witness, and yet the unbelievable suffering. Like, what we routinely hear at our distribution sites is gratitude to the United States of America, gratitude to the President of the United States, whom they directly attribute this aid as having come from, and Gazans cursing Hamas. And I think that that's telling. And when the world just sort of like lines up and takes information from Hamas, like, what about the people of Gaza whose legs will be broken today because they express their view, and their legs would be broken by Hamas? Like, that is the grave injustice. The people who sort of act like they're advocates for justice while simultaneously are only on the side of causing more suffering from the other side, to the people of Gaza. And I just think it's unbelievably profane.
Johnny, could you talk us through briefly the practicalities and the process that surrounds each of your distribution sites? So the aid from, going into the Gaza Strip to getting into the hands of these individuals, the times of day, the length of period of each of these specific distributions, because frankly, that's just not something that I think most people are seeing reported on, and I think it's important information.
Yeah, without going into too much detail, I mean, we have four major distribution sites. We're in the process of expanding to additional distribution sites. Hopefully we have a plan to do that. We're prepared to do it if this is a always constant changing dynamic situation on the ground. So whether plans ever get implemented or not has to do with a lot of different factors, but we're in the process of preparing for expansion. Food is pre-positioned in these distribution sites in boxes every day. We let in advance the people of Gaza know through common methods that they get information, social media, primarily certain social media accounts, and there are four distribution sites, three in the south, one in the center. And certain days, certain periods, we do women only distribution. Different distribution sites, there are other services that are available. Um, we hope to be able to expand to basically a 24/7 operation in some of these distribution sites, something the president has spoken about. But it's actually it's a complex logistical operation, but in terms of the way it operates, it's quite simple. We have secure sites that are basically warehouses. The food is pre-positioned. It's a self-distribution model, to use a World Food Program term. And then people take it. I mean that's the way it works.
A couple of questions here raise images of chaos and people running around the GHF distribution sites, um, uh, desperate to get there, uh, perhaps more so within the general distributions than the women only, women and children ones. But can you speak to those issues and how whether that is a developing situation or just part and parcel of your operations?
It is the nature of operating in an environment, not only in a war zone, but also where there's any food insecurity at all. And by the way, food insecurity isn't just not having enough food. Food insecurity is the general experience of insecurity, where people don't know if they'll have the opportunity to get food the next day or the day after. And so, at the beginning of our operation with GHF was the main, and by the way, GHF is still the main distribute. I think on scale, we distribute more food than any other organization. At least that was the case 2 weeks ago. Um, Yet, when GHF was the only organization really operating at scale, I think uh, people viewed basically saw for the first time what it is for people who need food to go to get it. When the UN, by the way, at the urging of GHF, was allowed to distribute more food in the Gaza Strip, I think people started realizing like everyone has this problem. Like people are hungry, they don't know if there's going to be enough food, they don't know if the food will come back tomorrow, and so they just go and get it. What we've seen at the GHF distribution sites, though, is that problem has significantly diminished as people know that we're going to be there and we're going to consistently deliver food. And then in addition to that, as more supply has gotten into the system, people don't feel like they have to come as frequently and all of these things, and it all calms down so much so that, recently some of our distribution sites became sort of a place where people just hung around, and it looked a little more like a Middle Eastern market, bazaar at a certain point. I'm afraid that with the next phase of this conflict, that as we see more and more distribution, we're going to see more and more desperation and more chaos. And that's where like we really don't have time for any politics whatsoever. GHF needs to be able to expand. GHF should be expanding with the partnership of other countries. Hopefully, the UN and our relationship moves from coexistence to collaboration, because there is going to be more chaos as more people are forced to move because the war continues.
So one of the questions was in relation to the new phase of this war and now the mass evacuation of civilians from Gaza City. How are you taking that into consideration and looking to meet these increasing challenges from those developments?
I mean, no one, not the UN, not GHF, no one has enough resources, enough food, enough anything for another massive wave of displacement. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. And so, it is, yeah, everyone's very concerned. I mean, and there's no time for politics. And unfortunately, there have been a lot of political decisions. I mean, there are political decisions coming from your country, political decisions coming from Geneva, all kinds of things that are I would say, while GHF is not a political organization, my political experience tells me that this is not the time for politics. It will only make a bad situation worse. And whether that's politics in Israel or politics in Brussels or London or wherever. We don't have time for any of it now, and everyone who wants to exploit this crisis knows very well how to use politics to do it. And and frankly, there are too many decisions that are being made, from my point of view, that are based upon domestic assumption, professing to make a difference in this conflict, that are only making the situation worse.
A number of questioners are asking about the IDF's involvement in either securing your sites or keeping the GHF distributors or even security personnel safe. So, what is the relationship with the IDF, and how does it practically manifest itself in those circumstances?
The GHF relationship with the IDF is no different from the UN relationship with COGAT. It's literally the same thing. It is a type of relationship that involves deconfliction and some coordination, but it is the same.
And are they providing security then, or is it simply a case of knowing
But
where?
we provide our own security. I mean, as in any active conflict, the you know the IDF has certain responsibilities when it comes to secure corridors and all of these things. But no, and that's the thing. Like when the irony at a certain point in the summer was that there was a ceasefire negotiation, which by the way was the United States basically had a deal to release hostages, to move to ending the conflict, to surge aid into the Gaza Strip. And then the president of France and the prime minister of the UK and the prime minister of Canada, uh, decided to make big political decisions. I'm not sure why, but it blew up the ceasefire negotiation and complicated every single thing. It was really, really, really unfortunate, and we saw it on the inside. I mean, we saw the effects of it on the inside in the Gaza Strip. It made everything more difficult.
Johnny, in terms of getting this information out to the broader um, consumers of media, one question asks, what journalists have been able to attend GHF activities and have they witnessed Hamas firing onto civilians?
So now, actually, we're going on over a month of having routine visits by not only journalists but also by members of Congress and parliamentarians from around the world. So we've now had a number of European parliamentarians. We've had I don't know over 20 members of Congress, including very very influential members of Congress. We had the president's envoy for special peace negotiations, Steve Witkoff, who I understand reported back to the president that the only thing working in the Gaza Strip was GHF. We're now on a regular routine basis inviting people to come see for themselves. It requires the diversion of resources because of the nature of the situation. I actually think GHF is the only organization that's able to provide journalists with direct interaction with the people of Gaza presently, because we uh, in effect, the rules of engagement for the embeds that the team has brought into the Gaza Strip is basically, you have to follow our rules once to get there, so you get there safely and all of these things. But once you're there, talk to whoever you want to talk to. You're free. And one of the things I'm most proud of is that we've been able, by opening our sites, to provide an opportunity for the people of Gaza to speak for themselves, not be spoken about as they routinely are. We can only do so much of it because it requires a lot of resource diversion ourselves in order to be able to do it, and it's not our core mission. But almost every day we have someone in the Gaza Strip. The priority have primarily been legislators for policy decisions, which are sort of downstream of all the conversation. But every few days we have a journalist in now.
Now, this term starvation has been, of course, and famine linked to that, extremely fraught. One question asks, given that you state a substantial quantity of food has been delivered to the people of Gaza, why does the prevailing narrative suggest that they are starving to death? What, in your view, is the main reason the media is not reporting on your organisations and others' delivery of food and humanitarian aid? And may I also, just on a practical level, add from my own perspective, what is the content of these boxes of food that you are delivering? How has that been determined? And when you say they'll feed, a family of five for a number of days, what is that calculation made on the basis of?
Yeah. So I'll answer the previous question first. The calculation is based upon our experienced veterans of the various international organizations, the United Nations, calculating what's needed for a family of five for 3.5 days. I mean, that's what it is. It includes lentils and pasta and oil and various things that you can look online. It's all there. It was not an arbitrary decision. It was a decision that was made with nutritional experts on the ground who have experience in this area. And actually, the quality of the food that we've been distributing is higher than the quality of food that's generally distributed. And one of the things I think is important is while we have flour in our boxes, we also have flour and other things. And I think, a lot of what we have seen in the Gaza Strip, when there's a need to surge aid in the Gaza Strip, we see truckloads of flour. But okay, that's fine for bakeries and all of these things, but it's just flour. From the very beginning, our boxes have included a variety of things, and then also more importantly, now we've distributed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these ready to use supplements. What was the first half of the question? My
Just in terms of the narrative on this and why your efforts aren't necessarily being.
Oh, it is just politics. I mean, when it comes to famine, for instance, like we don't deny that there has been severe hunger in the Gaza Strip. We don't even deny that there haven't been some incidences of uh, isolated incidents of starvation. We haven't seen famine in the Gaza Strip, and I do think as I alluded to a few moments ago, I mean, one of our challenges is that so much of the credentialing process has become political. And when I was working on my PhD, I did and my PhD is in public policy and religious track two diplomacy is what I wrote on. And I did a paper early in my graduate program about the initial reform of the whole UN human rights infrastructure. And it had gotten so catastrophic and so politicized and everything that we reformed it once before. And we're now in a situation where it seems like it's even worse than it was before, where virtually all the world's worst human rights violators are selecting those who are the policemen of the world for human rights violations. And I think, that unfortunately is not an isolated problem now. It proliferates our universities, it proliferates a number of international organizations, and it's just highly, highly politicized. And even when it comes to the questions of famine in the Gaza Strip, okay, well, they're talking about the north of the Gaza Strip as it is. If you look at their own data where we're operating, and by the way, we have routinely asked to operate in the north. We push to operate in the north. Uh, it isn't the Israelis actually that have stopped us from operating in the north. It's largely other humanitarian organizations and the way the system works and everything else. But we want to operate in the north. We have a plan to operate in the north. And when we couldn't open a secure distribution site in the north, we created a community distribution mechanism where we could, through partners, get food to the north anyhow. And that's been happening quietly for a long time. Um, but I read with great interest. I think there were three reports that came out from something called the National Contagion Research Institute at Rutgers University, which took the UN's own famine data and independently analyzed that data and came to some quite shocking conclusions about research design and even made a quite staggering accusation of data fraud. I think it's quite clear if you look at many of the people involved in these conversations. They have political views on the Middle East. And look, people have the right to have their views, but I'm not sure we have mechanisms to maintain objectivity. And it used to be that objectivity was more easily maintained when it came to numbers, because numbers are by their nature
Oh,
highly objective. But unfortunately, we're in a highly subjective time, and I just recommend everybody go to the sources before you draw your conclusions. And our conclusion is we desperately need more food in the Gaza Strip. There is hunger in the Gaza Strip. People need it. They need it now. They need it on scale, and especially as people are displaced. But we don't have to make politicized declarations in order to do that, and frankly to exaggerate it. And as someone who's been to many of the really, really food insecure places in the world. I've been to Dadaab in Kenya, and I was in Zatri throughout the different parts of the Syrian conflict. I've been to 100 countries, many, many countries, in profound, profound, terrible, terrible city. You think what's happening in the Sudan, which no one is talking about at all. And I think we have a lot of politicians sitting in the chairs of experts.
Well, one can have perhaps alternative opinions, but not alternative facts, and that's critical to getting, the realities and the truth out. Lots of questions actually on how to get the material that you have been covering more successfully out into the wider public. But of course, you're doing this webinar will significantly assist that, and as many people I hope will share the recording of it once it's up onto YouTube. We do normally, Johnny, keep these to an hour, but there have been so many questions and a few additional ones that, with your permission, we'll run a little over so that I can address them to you. One is with regard to Egypt and asking whether they are providing any aid into the Gaza Strip, and if so, whether that's being diverted or stolen. But I just wanted to use that as a leap pad to ask you also about Egypt's role here and this unique situation where not only has it closed its border, certainly over certain periods, to the facilitation of aid through it, but also for people to leave this war zone. And that, I think, uniquely has been endorsed in this context by the international community. From what you've seen on the ground in Gaza, is there any argument to utilising space outside of the Gaza Strip, away from Hamas, diversion of aid, stealing of aid, infiltration of humanitarian zones, and creating those sorts of distribution centres or even humanitarian tent cities, the other side of the Egyptian border? It's a question that I've certainly grappled with since October 2023. With your on the ground experience and the politics perhaps aside for a moment, do you think that would be feasible?
The first thing I would say is GHF and myself as a also, just as a long participant in policy in the Middle East and as a type of expert, we all oppose the involuntary displacement, forcing people to leave, all of these things. No one supports any of that, and overtly opposes it, in fact. But the irony of this war is that this is the only war that I've ever witnessed, or have been in proximity to. And again, I've been to lots of places around the world and lots of times of conflict. It's the only war where the international political system doesn't allow people to go to a safer place within the Gaza Strip or to a safer place temporarily outside of the Gaza Strip in order to save their own lives. I mean, this is a war, and wars are hell. And the United States wants the war to end, and everybody wants the war to end, it seems to me. Except for, I don't think Hamas wants the war to end. I mean, it's quite clear that if Hamas released the hostages and left the Gaza Strip, or pledged to not have a real role in the future of the Gaza Strip, the war would end. Um, but this war is the only war, it seems to me, in modern memory where people can't go to a safe place. And actually, you know, in most wars, and I'm not an expert on the laws of war. I'm an armchair expert maybe, but I mean, normally, in fact, a prerequisite, an obligation, is to make sure that there is a safe place for people to go where they can get temporary humanitarian assistance. And in the case of this war, if you were to throw out a term like a humanitarian zone, which is not a term I know from my work, but a term I've read in the press, like all of a sudden the world starts making accusations that are the most, I mean, to use a word like genocide, which is the worst crime in human history, as a synonym for allowing people in the line of fire to move to a safer place within the war zone or in proximity, near proximity to a war zone so that they can live, like so that they can survive. You know, I just think it's so I don't know how to get my head around this. And it's not and every country in the region and in other places have chosen to make policy decisions which have actually further imperiled the people of Gaza, and it's very, very sad. You know, this again, we interact with these people. Like, I wish these people could be in a safer place, but the world won't allow it. And then when there are rudimentary efforts to do it anyhow, you know, people are accused of trying to kill those they're trying to save, which is just it's just crazy to me. I just don't understand the rationale.
Well, you've mentioned this allegation of genocide. We have had a number of questions about the Commission of Inquiry report that came out a couple of days ago now. Not much new material in it, frankly. Having read it cover to cover, I can tell you that it regurgitates an awful lot of the so-called humanitarian organizations or human rights organizations who've already stuck their oar in on this particular subject. But picking up on your point in particular, it is extraordinary that on the one hand, the allegation is predicated on collateral damage, damage to civilians while strikes are being taken against terrorist infrastructure. But on the other hand, attempts to evacuate civilians are also used as a plank of this obscene allegation, which is, you know, of course, advanced for many of the political reasons that you've outlined. There is a question, Johnny, briefly, if I may, that asks. Although GHF is a US initiative and organization, not Israeli, is Israel permitting and facilitating aid forgive me, facilitating the GHF aid? And I just think it's helpful. I mentioned, of course, Article 23 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which is the general requirement to facilitate aid, caveated, of course, by that provision that it doesn't apply where there's reasons to believe that the enemy forces are diverting that aid. There are somewhat different rules that apply to the extent that a party is considered to be an occupier, so actually in effective control of that territory. And there's a big question as to where, or whether, if at all, and if so, where that might apply in the Gaza Strip. But then in those circumstances, it is open to that sovereign entity to determine the best effective means of facilitating or distributing that aid. And I am recalling now certain discussions about, you know, the partnership with GHF being an important aspect of that. I just also wanted to briefly touch on the context of the GHF operation starting, because there was a lot of controversy about the blockade that was instituted immediately after the breakdown of the ceasefire towards the early part of this year. And it strikes me that one of the key factors that hasn't been addressed at all in the context of, you know, allegations that Israel just cut off aid once that ceasefire fell apart after negotiations for phase two didn't go anywhere, was the existing aid situation on the ground. After 25,000 trucks were facilitated, and this is information that comes from COGAT, which is available, I'm sure you'll be familiar with it, on the Iron Swords COGAT website, where they chronicle all of the aid that has been facilitated into the Gaza Strip. The assessment after that ceasefire came to an end was that on the basis of 25,000 trucks having been facilitated into the Gaza Strip and the flooding of aid, which I think is a word that you used previously, that there were between 5 to 6 months worth of aid stockpiles within the Gaza Strip as a result. And the legal provisions and the legal framework, I think, needs to be understood in the context of the assessment that was made, you know, that there was sufficient food present in the Gaza Strip. I think that's just important to address for context. But of course, an additional part of that context that you've drawn out is that Hamas is diverting this aid. On the basis of all of that, are you in a position to assess aid levels in the Gaza Strip, or is it a case that you're just seeing, you know, what the state of people coming to these distribution sites is? And I know, of course, you've got medical teams on the ground treating people at these sites also. But what is your oversight of the general situation and levels of food provision in the Gaza Strip?
Yeah, so I would. I would say that our policy is to flood the zone. More food, more food, more food than is needed, perhaps, and just make sure that when you're doing it, that it's not able to be stolen by a terrorist organization. I mean, that is the policy of GHF. I would say I think that that there is a lot of food sitting in the Gaza Strip. Okay, and there's a lot of food that isn't being distributed sitting in the Gaza Strip that we would be happy to distribute still. Um, uh, I would also say like uh, we have a very dynamic relationship with with the state of Israel. Like we're always arguing with them and debating things, and like this is not a in many ways it's no different than the relationship with other international organizations. And if we see something we don't like, or if we see something that's needed, like we say it, and in fact sometimes we demand it, and very often we're able to facilitate it because President Trump has been quite clear that a top priority of his is making sure that the people of Gaza are fed. And at points he differed with the state of Israel on the nature of the food in the Gaza Strip. And as I've told my European friends, both in the EU and in the UK, if you like the president's point of view when it comes to hunger in the Gaza Strip, you have GHF to thank for that, because GHF is feeding information and learning and working very actively with the US government. I should say on the Commission of Inquiry, there's an irony here that I first of all, I'm a peace activist. My priority is peacemaking in the region, and that's what I was dedicated to prior to October 7th, and what I'm still dedicated to and will be dedicated to long after this war. Um, and yet, the irony in my, and I haven't read it cover to cover, but in my cursory reading of it, is that we basically have, while I don't want any wars in the world, we basically have a world where war sometimes happens, and war of any type is becomes a synonym of genocide, and we and it diminishes what when we actually do have genocidal activity around the world, and that's alarming to me. And secondly, I think it's quite obvious that the very few authors of that report are quite well-known figures when it comes to their own political points of view, and at a very minimum, they should have been recused from the entire process. And as GHF said publicly, GHF is referenced in the report, but GHF was never asked a single question by the Commission of an inquiry, which speaks to the entire process from beginning to end as likely being based more on politics than the facts, precisely timed to events happening in New York City in the next couple of days.
Well, final question for me, and my apologies to the many questions that we haven't had a chance to get to, but I hope I've provided a useful overview, and that is to do with the main sources of funding for GHF. Who is financing the food? Who is financing the distribution? And do you need more funding to be doing more work?
Yeah, we need a lot more funding, and we need funding from other countries. Some of those countries have chosen to disclose their involvement, like the United States. Some of them haven't, including some European countries, and a lot of individuals who've contributed are choosing to do it anonymously. And I get it. Everyone involved with GHF has had profound consequences. I mean, I in my own case, I've had just put it not just in me. I would say everybody involved with GHF has had threats to their life, for instance, for feeding people in Gaza. And so I used to have questions about anonymous contributions, either by individuals or nation states. I now more clearly understand why, because even when you try to do good for the world and you try to answer the call of the world to address a humanitarian crisis, there will always be those who oppose you and threaten you. But yeah, GHF could feed a lot more people if it had a lot more resources. And sadly, many of the countries of the world and organizations of the world that profess to care about these issues invest their money in political opposition as opposed to or PR campaigns to to discredit or delegitimize efforts like ours, rather than actually just like help us feed more people. And I don't know if GHF will be able to scale. I don't know if GHF will, be able to meet more needs. But we're dedicated to taking every ounce of energy, time, and resources that we have and doing one thing, which is more food directly to everyone we can reach for free as long as we can. And also, GHF was always meant to be temporary. We are not creating an organization to create another subsistence aid-based economy. We are willing to be around as long as possible or as long as needed to help people in need.
Well, I also know that this has come at some significant personal cost to you, and your home has been targeted, and that's been reported. So I'm extremely sorry about those consequences and those issues. Extremely grateful to you, Johnny, not just for leading this very important initiative in this work, but also for taking the time to address so many of these issues and questions and reports about your activities and provide such a level of in-depth insight into the realities on the ground. It's wonderful to hear that more journalists are now being able to visit your sites, but I think the hundreds of people who have joined this webinar are going to be in a much better informed position to address the important work of GHF, but also the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip more broadly. So thank you very much indeed for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me.